I always start off, tell me more, since it's about talking more about the lessons today, asking if anyone has any questions about the sermon or about any of the lessons today that I can answer. So Ed, you can't ask any questions because you always ask hard ones. I'm just kidding. Does anyone have any questions about the sermon? Yeah.
I know that today was the lesson in the gospel was from Matthew.
Mm-hmm.
I don't recall, Father Chris, does that segment appear in any of the other gospels?
I don't believe it does. I'm pretty sure what we read today, which is parabolic but not a parable, only appears in Matthew.
Which is interesting because Matthew looked at Mark and didn't appear in Mark.
Yeah, and there's questions. There's questions about which one was first. The way I was taught was that it's like an 80-20 split. Mark was written first, then Matthew. But historically, it's always been believed that Matthew was written first, which is why it has its place. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, in the order in which they were written. So if you go to the early church, the claim is Matthew, and Matthew remains up until, I think, the late 1800s, when scholarship decides that we think maybe Mark was written first. I have a little theory on that, or I think it's a good possibility that Matthew was kind of a scribe who was taking down a lot of the information that was being written, and Mark used that, but it wasn't actually in the narrative form. Like Matthew wasn't in the narrative form before Mark created the narrative form. So there's a possibility on that too. I wanted to sum up my sermon. This happens to me on a regular basis, and I think after writing my sermon, I need to go and read the hymns we're going to sing on Sunday, because we review all those during the week, and then I'm walking down the aisle or singing before the gospel procession, and I hear something in the hymn, I go, oh, someone else put it way better than I could. And so the opening hymn today, the third verse, let this mind be in us, which was in thee, who wast a servant that we might be free, humbling thyself to death on Calvary. Hallelujah. And so I think that really sums up a lot of what I said today in this. Our understanding of kingship is a bit different than Christ's. Of course, Jesus is the ultimate leader, and he comes to serve, not to be served. And that's one of the beauties of our faith in our belief. So, kind of working with that, what is the image of a king? When you think of a king, what do you think of? I always think of grandeur and that Mel Brooks movie where he always says it's good to be king. Is that the history of the world? Yeah, so when I always think of kingship, I always think of grandeur, I think of power. What do you think of when you think of what it means to be a king?
Royalties, crowns, jewels.
Royalty, crowns, jewels, absolutely. And so I wonder, as Americans, given our rebellious nature, do we look on the role of king favorably or not? I don't think we necessarily do. I've always found it to be a bit odd that monarchies still exist. Don't tell Charleston I said that. He loves them. And so the question I have is, was it ever God's intention to have a king, a human king, lead his people? Was it ever God's intention to have a human king lead his people? You'd think if it was, then Moses would have been a king at some point. Joshua would have been crowned a king at some point. But to answer that, I want to start in the book of Judges. And so the book of Judges mentions 11 leaders who are said to judge Israel or lead Israel. Othniel, Shamgar, Deborah, and of course Deborah's partner Barak, Gideon, Tola, Jair, Jephthah, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, and finally Samson. And so I always call the book of Judges the toilet bowl of the Bible, because it starts in an okay place, but then it just spirals down and down and down and down and down as each of these judges get further and further away from God and become more interested in themselves than in the promise, the covenant that they have made with God. And that brings us to 1 Samuel chapter 8, which is it's really one of my favorite parts of the Bible, because I think it applies concretely to everyone throughout history and still. So I want to read a little bit of that. When Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of the firstborn son was Joel. The name of the second, Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons did not walk in his way, but turned aside after gain. And so, you ever think about how sometimes kids who are raised with seemingly really great households and really great parents get all wacky and go sideways for a while, hopefully just for a while, and you wonder, how in the world did that happen? And it's interesting. I think pressure makes diamonds, and I think sometimes when we have it a little bit too good, we tend to forget who we need, and that causes us to lose our way. They took bribes and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations." Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the other nations. So Israel says, we want to be like everybody else. God says to Israel, you're special. You're not like everybody else. And Israel says, we want to be like everybody else. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." And Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, "Obey the voice of the people in all they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. According to all the deeds that they have done, from the day I brought them out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are also doing to you. Now then, obey their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them." And this goes to the point on damnation that I mentioned in the sermon today. God gives us what we want. God gives us what we ask for. And we should always be careful, because often what we want is not what's best for us. And I really do believe that Jesus, our judge at come judgment, will give us what we want. And I believe there are people that will look Jesus in the face and say, "Nah, not today, Jesus." And they will choose to be the goats that we heard in the gospel today. It continues. And I love this part. It's like when you tell your children exactly what their behavior is going to get them, not because you're going to punish them, but because they're going to fall off the slide face first, or because they're going to crash their bike into a mailbox. Both things my children have done after warnings. Watch where you're going. You're going to hit a mailbox. No, I won't. So here we go. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king from him. He said this, "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands of commanders of 50s, some to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. He will take 1/10 of your grain of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his servants. He will take your male servants and female servants and the best of your young men and your donkeys and put them to his work. And he will take 1/10 from your flocks, and he will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." So they're given a warning, like a typical teenager getting a warning from an adult, and they ignore it, and they insist on getting their own way. But the people refuse to obey the voice of Samuel. We're all pretty mature in this room, so if we got a warning like that, we'd probably take it pretty seriously. At least I think we might. But let's see. But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, "No, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles." They want someone else to fight their battles for them. Sounds like a rich kid. And when Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, "Obey their voice and make them a king." Samuel said to the men of Israel, "Go every man to his city. We have a people who have been rescued by God from slavery in Egypt, led by God through the desert, led by God to take the land he promised them, yet they reject the rule of God and insist on being ruled by man." So think about that. Let's put that in the context then, and then think about today. Israel is a people who in their recent memory have been rescued by God from slavery, being enslaved in Egypt, led by God through the desert, given the land he promised them, yet they reject God's rule and they insist on being ruled by an imperfect person. Think about everything that Jesus has accomplished for us. Salvation, eternal life, all done for us. Yet so often we find it easier to believe that when we're sick and we're anointed, we'll get better, but that God doesn't forgive people the way he promised to. And we strive so much for others to be punished and damned. And we damn them ourselves. And we find it so hard in our hearts to forgive people that have wronged us. And what we don't realize is that what we're doing is we're making whatever we won't let go and give to God a king, an evil, wicked king that rules over us and over our lives. We see this again in the Anglican world in the Act of Supremacy in 1534. It's an English Act of Parliament that recognized that Henry VIII as the supreme head of the Church of England. It sounds a lot like the King of Israel. The act also required an oath of loyalty from English subjects that recognized his marriage to Anne Boleyn, and it was repealed in 1555 under Mary, but then in 1559, Parliament adopted a new Act of Supremacy during the reign of Elizabeth I, and we continue to have the monarch of England being the head of the Anglican Church. The act declared that the king was the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England, and that the crown shall enjoy all honors, dignities, preeminencies, jurisdictions, privileges, authorities, immunities, profits, and commodities to said dignity. The wording of the act made it clear that Parliament was not granting the king the title, thereby suggesting they had the right to withdraw it later. Rather, it was acknowledged as an established fact. The Act of Supremacy, in the Act of Supremacy, Henry abandoned Rome completely and split from the church. He thereby asserted the independence of the Anglican Communion and appointed himself and his successors as the supreme rulers of the English Church. Earlier, when you think about it, Henry was declared defender of the faith by Pope Leo X for his pamphlet accusing Martin Luther of heresy. And then Henry, of course, does something very similar to what Martin Luther did. The 1534 Act marks the beginning of the English Reformation, and there were a number of reasons for the act, primarily the need for a male heir to the throne. Henry tried for years to obtain an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and had convinced himself that God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow, which is in the Old Testament. You should not marry your brother's widow. And so he used that. And it's interesting, there's a lot of questions about whether or not he should have been granted the annulment or not. And I think the annulment had more to do with Rome being surrounded by Spanish soldiers than the Pope disagreeing on what Henry was saying either way. But what you have again, after what we hear in the Old Testament in 1 Samuel, is again you have a human being declaring himself head of the church, which in and of itself is a very dangerous, I think it's a very dangerous thing. And I think we see that in the fundamentalism in Rome, in a lot of ways, where if you look at Anglican dogma, right, what you have to believe in order to be a Christian, it's very small and it's all found in the creeds. You read the creeds, that's our dogma. And you look at the Roman Church and the dogma in the Roman Church, and all of a sudden you have much bigger dogma. If I asked Dwight, do you think that Mary was bodily assumed into heaven? Yes or no? I'm going to put Dwight in the spot. No. Okay. So I think Mary was probably bodily assumed into heaven. I think if Elijah can be assumed into heaven, then certainly the mother of our Lord could be. We both get to come to this church, and it's perfectly okay for Dwight to think probably not, and me to think I hope so, and I think so, right? That's the beauty of not having a ton of dogma and making your dogma really concise, found in the creeds. So, what we see in these two circumstances is the people insisting on being ruled by fallible, corrupt, worldly powers and rejecting the rule of God in their life, thus demonstrating a total lack of faith. No matter who or what rules you on earth, Jesus is king. No matter who your boss is, how bad he or she treats you, Jesus is king. No matter what leaders in your community do, locally, state, nationally, Jesus is king. No matter who the governor of your state is, the president of the United States is, Jesus is king. The fact is, Christians lived for hundreds of years under oppressive regimes that wanted to kill them because they were Christians. The only way that they accomplished that was to know that Jesus is king. So, what I see in popular culture, I'm not just talking about young people, I'm talking about everybody in popular culture, is that we have become so easily manipulated to anger and fear that the idea of Jesus as king has completely gone away. And what we have established in culture and what the church has to stop doing is we are creating demigods of celebrity figures and politicians. That if this person was just in charge, the whole world would be fixed. If that person was just in charge, the whole world would be fixed. If this person was in charge, all that bad stuff that happened, it never would have happened. Even if you're talking about an earthquake or a hurricane or an act of nature. If the church just did more of this and it did more stuff, to really talk and endorse a certain political person, whoever it might be, boy, would we be better off. All of that is evidence that we are forgetting that Jesus is our King. And that no matter what we're going through, whether it's deeply personal, national, or the entire world, like a global pandemic, Jesus is King. And we have to have faith that while things are hard and uncomfortable, ultimately, Christ is in charge. And we look to that. We look to the parousia. We look to the end with anticipation, with excitement, not with fear. Ready for judgment. Ready for Christ to return. Craving the return of a real king. A servant king. who will die for us, who will give for us, and not take from us. That's all I have for today. So, do you guys have any questions? Ed?
Sometimes Scripture seems to be very clear in what it recommends or commends that we do. I think today's parable, although you presented it with Jesus as a very loving and generous and gentle, forgiving judge, but nevertheless, the mandate is clear. But sometimes, I'm speaking for myself, but I'm also asking as a more general question. Don't you sometimes find it very difficult to know what the Jesus commended thing is? Just two small examples. We had 10 or 12 years ago, Dr. Stanley Hauerwas was here. And I remember asking him, you know, the WWJD bracelets, and I don't remember what he said, other than it's kind of a stupid question. But also in Samuel, since you're talking about 1 Samuel, those anti-monarchical passages that you read are there and they're strong. On the other hand, as we all know, there are countervailing passages strongly in favor of a monarchy. And there was need for it with a threatened extension from the Philistines, who were not only technically but also politically much further advanced. And so, you know, I don't know, I think sometimes I'm just kind of dull, but often it seems to me that it's not at all obvious what I should do or one should do when one wants to follow Christ.
Yeah, I agree with you. Just remember, though, with the good comes the bad. And I guess not having a king would have been the leap of faith for Israel. Right? You're kind of assuming that God wouldn't have taken care of things without you know, David could have been a great judge.
I don't assume anything. I do understand, I think, the thinking on both sides.
Yeah.
As reflected in 1 Samuel.
Yeah. And so I would, as you were speaking, I thought of something, and I'm not remembering it now, but I think God gives us what we want, always. It doesn't always mean, like, I really want a lollipop right now. God's not going to make, there's a bug in here. God's not going to make a lollipop appear and give it to me, right? But ultimately, God gives us what we want.
Is that a good or a bad thing?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So I think, you know, Lewis talks about it. Was one of my favorite books is The Great Divorce. I know you guys, I'm pretty sure most of you know it. One of the striking things about reading, I got to read that for the first time. I think I was 15 years old, and I got to read it with Andrew Mead, Father Andrew Mead, and we read it at St. Michael's Conference when I was 15.
What is it?
The Great Divorce.
Oh.
And to be taught by someone like him when you're 15 is like an unbelievable privilege. And to be taught that book by someone like him is an even greater privilege, because that book is, and I've read The Great Divorce and taught The Great Divorce multiple times since reading it the first time. And I think one of the beautiful truths that's revealed in The Great Divorce is that ultimately our journey towards God continues in the afterlife, and it's ultimately up to us to continue that journey. And we can choose to not continue that journey and live in hell. And hell could be anything. It doesn't have to be the medieval Dante understanding of hell where, well, you like, one of my favorite episodes of The Simpsons, Homer sells his soul to the devil, and he goes to hell, and the devil says, so you like donuts, do you? And he just keeps feeding him donuts because that was his gluttonous. And then Homer's like, more. And then hell runs out of donuts, and the devil doesn't know what to do because Homer wants more donuts. So it's not like that, where there's the hellfire and the brimstone. Hell is separation from God. Hell is separation from God. And at the second coming, it's my understanding that evil is obliterated. Doesn't exist anymore. At the very least, quarantined. If to think about it in Norton antivirus terms. At the very least, it's quarantined. But I think evil, all evil, is obliterated, which means we are no longer able to be evil because we're in God's presence. When we choose to be in God's presence, His light burns that evil away and off of us. And so I really believe that the evil that happens in this world is all from us. I mean, if you look at you just look at the way society is, and you see evil on both sides of every issue, and so you have evil fighting with evil to try to do good. It's not like math where you get two negatives equal a positive. It doesn't work that way, And so I think the role of the church in all of this is to model as best we can the love of Christ, and not to choose sides politically. Not to choose sides. But to just, I would. My prayer is always for another Oxford movement to come up, and especially in the Episcopal Church, for another Oxford movement to come up, where you have conservative clergy moving into the worst parishes and making them giant, awesome, amazing parishes in inner cities, and changing the lives of all people around them, because that's God's call. That's the type of thing I pray for. So, thank you all for being. Yeah, Judd.
I really liked your point about, from Samuel and also, in our lives today, the fact that, we worship, we want to have other things in charge, be it politics or whatever it might be, and look to those, as a source of, restoring the world.
Yeah.
And rather than looking to Christ as our King. And I think that's, we're no different than people, than the people of Samuel.
Absolutely. And I think no matter what happens in the world, when Jesus is our King, we can keep going. It might hurt. It might stink. It might be horrible. But we can keep going because Jesus is our King. And that, I think, is the key. Keep going. Jesus is our King.